Welcome to Vintage Horror, where the darkness comes alive. Before we begin, tell us, where are you watching from? What time is it in your world right now? And most importantly, how does this tale make you feel? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and brace yourself for a chilling journey into the unknown. Gray in the grave. It was a warm Saturday late afternoon when I took my camera to St. Agnes Cemetery on the edge of Ashwood, Pennsylvania. The sun hung low, casting golden streaks through the pines that framed the place, their shadows stretching long across the uneven ground. I'd come back to Mom's house a few weeks earlier, jobless, drifting after the city chewed me up, and needed something to fill the days. The Nikon, scratched and heavy from years of use, dangled from my neck as I walked the mile from home, the air thick with damp grass and the faint buzz of flies. St. Agnes was old, forgotten, rusted gates half open, headstones tilting into the earth, and I'd always liked its quiet, a break from the noise in my head. That day I wanted photos, moody shots for a portfolio, something to prove I still had it. The cemetery was a maze of weathered stones, names faded, dates swallowed by lichen, some cracked clean through. I wandered, snapping wildflowers tangled around a child's grave. A crow perched on a crooked cross. The shutters clicked sharp in the stillness. Then I found the Blackwood plot. 6 graves, ringed by a wrought iron fence. The family name carved bold into a central slab. Blackwood, 1792. Mom had mentioned them once. Distant kin, she'd said. Some thread of her dad's blood that ran dry long ago. I didn't care much. Just frame the shot. The fence's shadow slashing the graves, sunlight glinting off chipped granite. Click. The sound echoed, clean and final. And I moved on, chasing the fading light until the battery blinked red, and I headed home. Mom's kitchen was cluttered, yarn spilling across the table, a cold tea mug by the sink. When I plugged the SD card into my laptop, the photos loaded slow. Wildflowers, vivid and sharp. The crow, its eye a dark pinprick. Then the Blackwood shot and I stopped breathing. There, over Thomas Blackwood's grave, 1845 to 1901, a figure stood, gray, blurred, like smoke shaped into a man, tall and thin, its edges fraying into nothing. No face, just a blank oval where one should have been, arms limp at its sides. I hadn't seen it, not through the lens, not standing there. The other graves were empty, the fence crisp. But Thomas's stone held this thing. I zoomed in, pixels stretching. The figure stayed, gray and solid, rooted like it belonged. My gut twisted, a cold sweat prickling my spine, and I flipped through the rest. No smudges, no tricks, just stones and grass. I rebooted, reloaded, same shot, same figure, unchanged. Mom, I called, voice thin, leaning back. She shuffled in from the living room, glasses low on her nose, peering at the screen. What's that? She asked, squinting, calm, but curious. I pointed, finger shaky. By Thomas's grave. Wasn't there when I took it. Her frown deepened. Then she straightened, a flicker of unease crossing her face. Blackwoods, she muttered, almost to herself. Your grandpa said they carried weight. Bad luck, maybe. Never liked that plot. She shrugged, turning away, but her hands tugged at her sweater, a nervous tick I knew too well. Sleep didn't come that night. The gray figure burned into my skull, faceless and still, waiting. The house creaked, old wood settling, normal sounds. But every groan felt heavier, every shadow sharper. At 2 a.m., I checked the camera again. Still there, gray and silent. I deleted it, the file vanishing with a click, but the cold lingered, a stone in my chest that wouldn't shift. Sunday broke over Ashwood with a muggy, oppressive heat that settled into the town like a damp shroud. The sky a flat, featureless slab of white that pressed down on the rooftops, muting the usual chatter of birds into a faint, listless hum. I hadn't slept, not a wink, since that first photo from St. Agnes Cemetery flashed across my laptop screen. The gray figure standing over Thomas Blackwood's grave, its faceless head, a blank smudge where life should have been. My eyes burned, gritty and raw. The lids heavy as if lined with sand, and my head buzzed with a restless static, a low drone that wouldn't quit, looping that image. Tall, thin, fraying at the edges, over and over until it felt etched into my skull. Mom's words lingered too, her fidgeting hands tugging at her sweater as she muttered about Grandpa and the Blackwoods. Bad luck. A half-told warning I couldn't shake. I needed proof, something to bury this, to call it a trick of light, or a glitch in the Nikon's lens. So, I grabbed the camera, its scratched body, a familiar weight against my chest, the strap digging into my shoulder as I slung it on. The battery was fresh, a green bar glowing on the display, and I pocketed my phone too, its camera a backup. A second high, if the Nikon lied again. My boots thudded against Mom's porch steps. The wood warped and splintered underfoot, creaking with a groan that echoed in the still air as I stepped into the street, the asphalt shimmering faintly with heat haze, a mirage that danced at the edges of my vision. The mile to St. Agnes felt longer today, the air thick and syrupy, clinging to my skin in a sheen of sweat that beaded on my forehead, trickling down my temples to sting my eyes with salt. The cemetery gate loomed ahead, a rusted skeleton of iron bars, half open as always, its hinges sagging under decades of neglect, the metal flaking into reddish dust that stained my palms as I pushed through. Inside, St. Agnes was a sprawl of decay, headstones leaning like broken teeth, their surfaces pocked with lichen and moss, names and dates eroded into faint scratches, barely legible under the overcast light. The ground was soft, damp from some unseen seep, each step a faint squish beneath my boots, the grass patchy and yellowed, tangled with wild weeds that snagged at my laces. Cicadas droned from the pines, ringing the perimeter, a pulsing, relentless hum that vibrated through the air, thick with the scent of sap and the sour rot of leaves piled in the corners, fermenting into a dark, earthy musk that coated my throat with every breath. I wove through the rows, my shadow stretching long and thin across the stones, a distorted echo of myself that flickered with each step, the Nikon bouncing against my chest, its lens cap rattling faintly. The Blackwood plot waited at the back. 6 graves fenced in wrought iron, the bars twisted and pitted, glinting dull under the haze, the family name carved deep into a central slab, Blackwood, 1792. Thomas's stone stood at the heart, 1845 to 1901, its edges chipped and jagged, lichen creeping up its sides in green veiny streaks that pulsed faintly in the dim light, as if alive. I stopped a few feet away, the cicadas' hum swelling to a roar in my ears, my pulse a steady thud against my ribs, and wiped my palms on my jeans, sweaty, gritty, leaving a dark smears on the faded denim. The graves were unchanged, Thomas's slab steady, the others weathered but still, no movement, no flicker of gray in the corners of my vision. I raised the Nikon, fingers trembling as I adjusted the focus, the lens whirring softly, framing Thomas's stone tight in the viewfinder. The iron fence, a sharp slash across the shot. My breath held, a tight knot in my chest. Click. The shutter snapped, crisp and final, the sound cutting through the drone like a blade. I lowered the camera, exhaling slow, then pulled my phone from my pocket, its screen glowing harsh against the muted light, and lined up the same angle. Thomas's grave centered, the fence dark. Snap. The digital shutter clicked. A softer echo of the Nikon's bite. 2 shots. 2 chances to prove this was nothing, to kill the shadow clawing at my mind. I didn't check them there. Couldn't, not with the air pressing close, a damp weight that squeezed my lungs, the cicadas' hum rising to a fever pitch, a warning I felt in my bones. My boots crunched gravel as I turned back, the gate squeaking shut behind me, the sound swallowed by the heat as I trudged home, the Nikon swinging heavy, the phone a cold lump in my pocket. Mom was gone. Church, maybe, or the store. The house silent as I stepped inside. The kitchen table bare, but for my laptop. Its screen dark, reflecting my pale, sweat-streaked face as I sank into the chair. My hands shook as I plugged in the Nikon's SD card. The faint whir of the drive spinning up a lifeline in the quiet. The photos loading slow, wildflowers from yesterday, sharp and vivid. The crow's black eye, glinting, then the Blackwood shot. My breath stopped, a cold fist closing around my chest. There it was, the gray figure, taller now, its edges crisper, standing not on Thomas's grave, but beside it. Closer to the frame's edge, its blank oval of a face tilted, slight, deliberate, like it saw me through the lens. My stomach twisted, a nauseous lurch, and sweat beaded cold on my back, soaking my shirt as I swiped to the phone shot. Same scene, same figure, same tilt, but closer still. Its arms hanging limp, but angled toward me, fraying into the air like smoke caught mid-drift. A tendril of gray curling into the haze. I flipped between them, Nikon, phone, Nikon, phone. Each image a mirror, each figure a step nearer. The tilt sharper, the blankness more intent, a silent stare that bore into me through the screen. The room spun, the hum of the fridge, a distant buzz as I gripped the table, my knuckles whitening, nails digging into the wood, leaving faint crescents in the grain. Not a glitch, not light or dust. It was there, caught twice, real, moving. I fumbled my phone, the screen slipping in my sweaty grip, and dialed Mom, her voicemail kicking in after 3 rings. Hey, it's me, the Blackwood photos. It's back. Call me. My voice cracking, thin, lost in the static. As I dropped the phone, its clatter loud against the table, a jolt that snapped me upright. The day dragged on, heat thickening the house, the laptop glowing with that gray tilt. A beacon I couldn't shut off, pacing the living room instead, the floorboards creaking under my boots. Each step a thud that echoed in my skull. Dusk fell slow, the haze outside deepening to a bruised purple, shadows pooling in the corners, and the prickle hit, faint but growing, a tickle on my neck like eyes brushing my skin. I turned slow, deliberate, the window behind me a black rectangle reflecting the room, the couch, the lamp, my silhouette, and something else, a smudge, gray, tall, and thin, flickering in the glass, its edges rippling like heat haze, gone when I blinked. My breath snagged, a sharp gasp that fogged the air, and I yanked the curtains shut, the fabric rough under my fingers, dust puffing into the room as my heart slammed against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat I couldn't quiet. Mom got home at 8, the front door creaking open, her arms full of grocery bags that rustled as she set them down, her face creasing with a frown when she saw me. pacing, the laptop open to those twin shots. The gray figure, closer, tilted, watching. "What now?" she asked, voice tight, stepping closer. And I pointed. 2 shots, 2 figures, 2 steps nearer, my hand trembling, the air between us heavy with unspoken dread. She went still, lips thinning, her glasses slipping as she leaned in, then pulled back, her hands fidgeting with her sweater, tugging at the hem as she turned to the shelf, yanking down an old photo album, leather-bound, its spine cracked, pages yellowed and brittle under her fingers. She flipped through it, fast, purposeful, stopping at a grainy shot. Grandpa, young, maybe 30, standing by the blackwood graves, his face stern, his hat tilted against the sun. Behind him, faint, almost lost in the sepia, a gray blur, tall and thin, faceless, its edges fraying into the background, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. "He saw it," I whispered, my voice barely audible, the cold sinking deeper, a weight that pressed my chest, and Mom nodded, slow, her fingers tightening on the album's edge, the paper crinkling under her grip. "Never talk much," she said, voice low, unsteady, just said to stay clear, turned white if you pushed him. Thought it was nonsense, old man's tales. She shut the album, hard, a dull thud, and the room went quiet. The cicadas hum, a faint echo through the walls, the prickle on my neck sharpening, a needle under my skin. That night I slept with the lights on, harsh, buzzing fluorescence that cast stark shadows across the ceiling. The gray figure's tilt burned into my eyes, a shadow I couldn't outrun, a call I couldn't unhear, growing louder in the dark. Monday dawned heavy over Ashwood, the sky a roiling mass of charcoal clouds that swallowed the sun, casting the town in a dim, bruised light that flickered with the promise of rain. The air hung thick and restless, a damp weight that pressed against my skin, seeping into my lungs with every shallow breath. The faint tang of ozone prickling my nostrils as thunder rumbled low in the distance, a growl that vibrated through the floorboards of Mom's house. I hadn't left the kitchen since dawn, couldn't, not after the gray figure's tilt sharpened in those photos, not after it flickered in the window at dusk, its faceless stare, a shadow I felt on my neck, a prickle that had grown from a tickle to a steady gnawing ache, like a splinter lodged too deep to pull free. My laptop sat open on the table, the twin shots, Nikon and phone, glowing harsh against the gloom, the figure closer, its blank head angled toward me, arms lifting slightly, fraying into the air like smoke caught in a draft. Sleep had dodged me again. My eyes were bloodshot, the whites webbed with red veins, the lids swollen and gritty, each blink a rasp of sandpaper that stung deep into my sockets. My hands trembled as I gripped a mug of cold coffee, the ceramic chipped and stained, the liquid inside bitter and stale, coating my tongue with a sour film that made my stomach churn. The Nikon rested beside the laptop, its lens cap off, the glass glinting faintly in the dim light. A silent witness to the thing I'd caught twice now. Real, moving, mine. Mom had left for work at first light, her footsteps fading down the porch steps, her parting glance lingering, worried, tight-lipped, before the door clicked shut, leaving me alone with the house, its silence, a weight that pressed against my ears, broken only by the faint hum of the fridge and the creak of old wood settling under the storm's breath. I needed answers. Something beyond Mom's album, beyond Grandpa's gray blur. So I grabbed my phone, its screen scratched and smudged, and dialed the Ashwood Historical Society, Mrs. Hargrove's number scrawled on a scrap of paper from years back. Her sharp voice, a lifeline I clung to. The line crackled as it connected, static hissing like whispers through the wire, and she answered on the fourth ring. Hello? Her tone clipped, edged with the rasp of age, the storm's growl seeping through the call. Mrs. Hargrove, it's me. About the Blackwoods, I said, voice rough, my throat dry as sand, the words tumbling out fast. Thomas, he's in my photos, following me. Mom said Grandpa saw it too. What is he? A pause, long, heavy. Then her voice dropped, low and deliberate, cutting through the static like a blade. Blackwoods? Old blood. Mill owners. Land barons. Ran this town dry once. Thomas was the last big name. Born 1845. Died 1901. Pneumonia's what they wrote. But folks knew better. Whispers said he torched his own warehouse, debts up to his neck, creditors pounding his door, killed 2 men in the blaze, pinned it on faulty lamps. No proof, no trial, buried fast, hush hush, with a locket, silver engraved, some heirloom they said would keep him quiet. Didn't work, did it? Your kin, your mom's side, right? Her words sank into me, cold and sharp, a history I hadn't asked for, a weight I couldn't shed. Yeah, I croaked, my grip tightening on the phone, the plastic creaking under my fingers. But the line hissed louder, static swelling, a low hum, like breath through water, drowning her next words. Hello, Mrs. Hargrove? Nothing, just a rasp, dry and faint, then a click. The call dead, the storm cutting her off her. Something else, something closer. The prickle flared, hot, sudden, a jolt that raced down my spine. And I dropped the phone, its clatter loud against the table, spinning to the window behind me. The glass was fogged, rain streaking it in jagged lines. But there, a gray smudge, tall and thin, pressed against the pane, its blank face tilted sharp, arms raised, fraying into the downpour like smoke caught in a gust, rippling with the wind's howl. My chair scraped back, harsh, loud, toppling as I stumbled up, heart slamming against my ribs, a frantic thud that echoed in my ears. My hands fumbling for the Nikon. Instinct, panic, the lens whirring as I snapped the window. Click, the shutter biting through the silence. I checked it, breath hitching, the screen glowing. There it was. Gray, thin, outside now, not a reflection. Head tilted sharper, arms higher, reaching, its edges curling into the rain like tendrils testing the air. The phone next. Snap. Same shot. Same figure. Closer. Its blankness, a void that swallowed the light. A stare I felt in my gut, cold and deep. Shit, I rasped, voice breaking, the cold flooding my chest, and I heard it. A shuffle, faint but real, behind me. A soft drag across the linoleum, slow and deliberate. I spun, the kitchen empty, the fridge humming, shadows pooling in the corners, but the floor creaked. A single, heavy step from the hall, wood groaning under weight it shouldn't bear. My hands shook as I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer, battered, heavy, its beam flickering to life, cutting through the gloom as I edged toward the sound, the linoleum slick under my boots, muddy streaks smearing wider with each step. The hall yawned ahead, dark, narrow, the floral wallpaper peeling in long curling strips, their faded roses drooping like wilted flesh, the air plunging cold, my breath fogging thick, swirling in the beam's shaky glow. Another creak, closer, by the stairs, a slow, deliberate groan that sank into my bones, and I called out, "Who's there?" Voice cracking, thin, lost in the storm's rumble, the flashlight sweeping, wild. Nothing, just shadows, dancing, until it hit the mirror at the landing. There, A gray figure, tall and faceless, standing behind my reflection, its head tilted sharp, arms lifting higher, fraying into the glass like smoke seeping through cracks. Its blankness, a hole that sucked at my vision. My chest seized, breath fogging fast, a plume that clouded the air, and it moved slow, a step forward in the mirror, its edges rippling, though the halls stayed empty, the creak echoing. Creak, creak. Behind me now, real, not glass-bound. I yelled a raw, guttural sound and swung the flashlight. Beams slashing air, the hall silent, but for my ragged gasps, the mirror empty when I looked again, fog dissipating, my face alone, pale and wild, eyes wide with terror. The storm roared, thunder cracking, rain lashing the roof in sheets, and I ran back to the kitchen, boots slipping, slamming the door, the wood rattling in its frame as I braced it, flashlight clattering to the floor, its beams spinning wild before dying. The shuffle followed, creak, creak, slow, relentless, through the door, wood groaning under pressure, and a sound came. Ha-ha, low, dry, raspy, like dust scraped over stone. Not a laugh, but a call, a claim. My name twisted in its rasp. Mine. Faint. Hissed. Seeping through the cracks. My back pressed against the door. Sweat and rain mixing on my skin. The cold sinking deeper, and I whispered, Thomas. The name. A plea. A curse. And the creak stopped. Sudden, absolute silence, falling thick. The rain's roar, a dull pulse outside. I slid to the floor, back against the door, hands shaking as I clutched my knees, the knife forgotten on the table, the Nikon beside it, its lens staring blank into the dark. The prickle burned, hot, close, a brand on my neck, and I felt it. He was here, in the house, in the walls, in the air, his gray shadow stretching along, a presence I couldn't see, but couldn't deny. The storm raged, wind howling, thunder shaking the windows, and I stayed there, breath fogging, eyes darting, window, ceiling, door, every shadow, a threat, every creak, a step. Thomas Blackwood, my blood, my ghost, following me still, his call a rasp I'd never outrun. The storm didn't let up as I stumbled away from the house, rain hammering ashwood in relentless sheets, turning the streets into rivers of mud that sucked at my boots. My flashlight swung wild in my grip, its beam cutting through the downpour, catching glints of wet asphalt and the skeletal shapes of trees bending under the wind. The prickle on my neck burned now, a sharp, constant stab, like a nail pressed into my skin, and I felt it. That gray figure, Thomas Blackwood, my blood, my shadow, trailing me. The raspy call, ha-ha, still echoed in my skull, dry as dust, heavy as stone, and I ran faster, breath ragged, the cold sinking into my bones despite the muggy air. I didn't stop until I hit downtown, a cluster of sagging storefronts and flickering streetlights, the Ashwood Historical Society's office, a squat brick building at the end of Main Street. Mrs. Hargrove's voice from the phone call, crackling, cut by static, played on loop. Thomas, died 1901. Bad blood. A locket. The windows glowed faintly, a dull yellow against the storm, and I pounded the door, knuckles stinging, water streaming down my face. Mrs. Hargrove, I shouted, voice hoarse, barely audible over the thunder's growl. The shuffle came first, slow, deliberate. Then the lock clicked, and she peered out, her gray hair a frizzy halo, eyes narrowing behind thick glasses. Boy, what in God's name? She started, but I pushed past her, dripping mud onto the hardwood, the door slamming shut behind me. The office smelled of dust and old paper, shelves sagging with books and files, a single lamp buzzing on her desk. "It's following me," I said, words tumbling out, my flashlight trembling as I set it down. "Thomas Blackwood, in the photos." The mirror outside, it said my name, or something did. She froze, her hand hovering over a stack of folders, then gestured to a chair, wooden, creaking as I sank into it, my soaked jacket clinging to my shoulders. "Slow down," she said, voice sharp but unsteady, pulling a ledger from a drawer, leather-bound, edges frayed, the kind that hadn't been touched in years. "Your kin, you said, your mom's side. Let's see what's stirring him up." She flipped it open, pages crackling, her finger tracing faded ink as rain lashed the windows, the glass rattling in its frame. "Thomas Blackwood," she read, voice low. "Born 1845, died 1901. Mill owner, last of the big ones. Owned half the town once. Land, lumber, the works. Official record says pneumonia took him, but folks didn't buy it. Whispers where he burned his own warehouse. Debts piling, creditors circling. Killed 2 workers in the blaze. Pinned it on bad wiring. Buried quick, no inquest. Family put a locket in the coffin, silver, engraved, some heirloom he'd worn since a boy. Said it'd keep him settled." She paused, glancing up, her eyes sharp. "Didn't, looks like." The prickle flared, hot now, like a brand, and I gripped the chair, my knuckles white. "He's not settled," I said, voice shaking. "He's in my shots. Gray. Faceless. Moving closer. Saw him in the mirror, heard him. Ha ha. Like he's calling me. Mom's dad saw it too, years back." My breath fogged, the room plunging cold despite the heat outside, and Mrs. Hargrove's face tightened, her glasses slipping as she leaned forward. "Blood calls blood," she muttered, flipping to another page. Newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle, glued into the ledger. Here, 1902, a year after he went down. His son, Elias, your great-great something, swore the grave was disturbed. Stone shifted, dirt loose. Said he saw a gray shape by the mill ruins, watching him. Left town after, never came back. Then your grandpa. Folks said he avoided Saint. Agnes turned pale if you asked why. Blackwoods don't rest easy. Something's tying him here, and you've got his name in you. Thunder cracked, the lamp flickering, and I felt it. A shuffle, faint, behind me. I turned, slow, the beam of my flashlight still on the desk, catching the window. There, a gray smudge, tall and thin, pressed against the glass, its blank face tilted sharp, arms raised, fraying into the rain like smoke caught in a gust. "There!" I yelled, scrambling up, the chair toppling, and Mrs. Hargrove gasped, her ledger thudding to the floor, as she saw it too. Gray, faceless, real. "Out, now!" she barked, grabbing a key ring from the desk, her hands trembling as she shoved me toward a back door, narrow, paint peeling, leading to an alley. The shuffle grew, creak, creak, inside now, wood groaning under weight, and that raspy call, ha ha, scraped through the air, closer, louder, dry as a grave. She flung the door open, rain blasting in, and I stumbled out, mud splashing my jeans, her voice fading as she slammed it shut. "Find the locket! Break it!" The alley was a tunnel, dark, slick trash cans rattling in the wind. And I ran, flashlight bouncing, its beams slicing through the storm. The prickle didn't fade, sharper, hotter, a pull I couldn't shake. And I heard it, creak, creak, slow steps behind me, steady despite the rain's roar. I glanced back, nothing but shadows, wet brick, and a flicker, gray, tall, fraying, at the alley's mouth, gone when I blinked. My chest burned, lungs screaming, and I broke onto the street. The Historical Society, a dark blur behind me. The figure's call, ha ha, echoing in the thunder. My name twisted in its rasp. I didn't stop. Ran through town, past the diner's neon glow, the shuttered gas station, until I hit the mill road, old, overgrown, leading back to St. Agnes. The cemetery loomed ahead, gates glinting wet, and I knew it. Thomas wasn't just following, he was pulling me back, his blood in my veins a leash I couldn't cut. The locket, silver, buried, his anchor, flashed in my mind. Mrs. Hargrove's words, a lifeline. Break it. But the creak followed. Creak, creak, closer now. And the gray shadow stretched long in the corner of my eye. Faceless, relentless. Mine. The rain was a living thing as I fled down the mill road toward St. Agnes Cemetery. A relentless, icy whip that stung my cheeks and plastered my hair to my forehead. Each drop a cold needle sinking into my skin. The storm had turned the dirt path into a quagmire, thick and black, sucking at my boots with wet, greedy slurps that dragged my steps, threatening to pull me down into its grasp. My flashlight dangled from my wrist, its thin beam swinging wildly, slicing through the downpour to reveal jagged glimpses of the world. Twisted branches clawing at the sky, puddles rippling like dark mirrors, and ahead, the cemetery gates, their rusted iron bars glinting wet, a skeletal frame against the churning gray of the night. The prickle on my neck was no longer just a sensation. It was a fire, a searing weight that pulsed with every heartbeat, as if an unseen hand pressed down, forcing me back to the place where Thomas Blackwood's gray shadow had first found me. I shoved through the gates, the metal screeching against its hinges, a high-pitched wail that cut through the storm's roar, rust flaking onto my palms like dried blood. Inside, St. Agnes sprawled before me, a chaotic sprawl of ancient headstones, their surfaces pocked and moss-eaten, tilting at odd angles, as if the earth itself had tried to spit them out. The wind howled through the pines at the cemetery's edge, their needles hissing and thrashing, flinging sharp, resinous scents into the air, pine sap, wet rot, and the heavy, loamy reek of disturbed soil. My breath came in short, ragged bursts, fogging in front of me, despite the muggy heat that clung to Ashwood, a cold that seeped from somewhere deeper, somewhere wrong. The Blackwood plot was my beacon. I staggered toward it, flashlight beam trembling, its weak light barely piercing the rain-soaked darkness. My left knee buckled as I tripped over a low stone. Elizabeth Hayes, 1873 to 1880. The inscription blurred by lichen and time, my shin slamming into its edge with a dull, wet crack. Pain flared, hot and bright, radiating up my leg as I bit down on a curse, my hands sinking into the muddy grass to push myself up. The ground beneath me was slick, a treacherous carpet of tangled roots and sodden earth that shifted under my weight, and I clawed my way forward, the flashlight strap digging into my wrist, its plastic casing slicked with rain and sweat. There it was, the Blackwood graves, 6 slabs encircled by a wrought iron fence, its bars twisted and pitted with rust, the family name etched into a central monolith, Blackwood, 1792. Thomas's stone stood at the heart, 1845 to 1901, its surface weathered to a dull gray, the edges chipped as if gnawed by time, lichen creeping up its sides like green veins. I stopped a few feet away, chest heaving, water streaming from my soaked jacket, pooling at my boots in dark rivulets that snaked into the mud. The beam swept across the plot, slow, deliberate, searching for that gray smudge, That faceless shape I'd seen in my photos, my mirror, my nightmares. Nothing, just stone, fence, and the relentless patter of rain. Each drop a tiny hammer against the earth. Then the prickle surged, hot, sharp, a jolt that raced down my spine, and the ground beneath my feet shivered, a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through my soles, up my legs, into my ribs. I froze, breath caught, the flashlight slipping in my grip as I steadied it on Thomas's grave. "Thomas," I whispered, the name a rasp torn from my throat, half a challenge, half a surrender, and the world answered. Wind dying to a sudden, eerie hush, raindrops hanging suspended in the air, glistening like glass beads in the beam's faint glow, time itself holding its breath. The response came. Ha 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 ha, dry and raspy, not from the sky but from below, a sound that clawed its way up through the mud at Thomas's stone, scraping against my ears like sandpaper on bone. My knees hit the ground, hard, mud splashing up my thighs, and the beam caught it. The stone shifted, a slow, deliberate tilt, its base cracking as black soil spilled outward, wet and glistening, like the earth was bleeding. The creak followed, creak, creak, a steady rhythm rising from the depths, wood or bone or something older. Each sound a step closer, a presence climbing free. My stomach lurched, bile rising, and I muttered, "No, no, no." The words lost in the stillness as I lunged forward, hands plunging into the muck. Mrs. Hargrove's command ringing, "Find the locket, break it." The soil was frigid, a sharp contrast to the humid night, clinging to my fingers in thick, slimy clumps that smelled of decay, rotted leaves, stagnant water, and something metallic, like old blood. My nails tore into it, scraping against pebbles and roots, the mud sucking at my wrists as I dug deeper, the flashlight propped beside me, its beam a pale pool on the shifting stone. The grave shuddered again, a crack splitting the slab's base with a sound like breaking ice, white roots snapping free, curling upward like skeletal fingers, and my hand struck metal, cold and unyielding, buried just beneath the surface. I clawed harder, breath hitching, fingers wrapping around a small, rusted iron box, its edges biting into my skin as I yanked it loose, the ground resisting with a wet, reluctant slurp. The storm roared back, rain crashing down, wind screaming through the pines, thunder rolling low and long as I pried the box open, hinges groaning like a wounded animal, rust flaking into the mud. Inside, nestled in a bed of decayed velvet, lay the locket, silver, blackened with tarnish, its chain coiled tight like a serpent, an engraving etched into its face. TB, 1860. Thomas Blackwood's, his anchor, his curse, buried to keep him silent. My trembling fingers fumbled it open, a faint click against the storm's din, revealing a lock of hair, dark and brittle, strands snapping as I touched them, and a sepia photo, edges curled, showing a man with sharp cheekbones, a tight-lipped scowl, and eyes that pierced through the years. Thomas, alive once, his head tilted in that same eerie angle I'd seen in the grave figure. The prickle burned, hotter, closer, a brand searing my neck, and a creak exploded. Creak, creak, loud and insistent, mud bubbling up from the hole, dark and viscous, rippling like a living thing. I staggered to my feet, locket clutched tight, and the ground heaved, a jagged fissure, tearing through Thomas's stone, splitting it into jagged halves that sank inward, swallowed by the earth. "You're done," I rasped, voice raw, raising the locket high, my arm trembling as I brought it down, hard, against the nearest gravestone, metal clanging, a dent buckling its surface, glass within shattering with a brittle pop. The ha-ha erupted, dry, furious, a howl that rattled my teeth, and the beam caught it, a gray shape rising from the hole, tall and thin, its faceless head tilted sharp, edges fraying wildly in the wind, arms reaching long and skeletal toward me. I swung again, harder, the chain snapping, links scattering into the mud, the photo tearing free, fluttering wet and ruined. The figure lunged, breath hit my face, dry as ash, cold as frost, a rasp hissing, mine, my blood, my name, my fate, and I stumbled, boots slipping, mud sucking me down as its touch grazed my cheek, a frigid burn that stole my breath. My lungs seized, a phantom chokehold tightening, and I grabbed the flashlight, desperation surging, smashing it into the locket, metal screeching, the beam flaring bright, then dying as the casing cracked. The locket buckled, shards flying, hair crumbling to dust, and the figure froze, mid-reach, its blank face tilting one last time before fraying apart, gray dissolving into the rain, the ha-ha fading to a thin, dying wheeze. The ground settled, the fissure gaping, mud pooling still, the broken lockets remains glinting among the wreckage, silver shards winking in the rain like fallen stars. I sank back, gasping, rain washing mud and cold from my skin, the prickle easing, slowly, faintly, then gone. The cemetery hushed, wind softening, pines swaying gentle, the tap, tap, tap of rain, a steady, normal rhythm. I rose, legs unsteady, the flashlight dead in my hand, and limped toward the gate, leaving the shattered locket behind, but a shadow lingered, faint, gray, a whisper in my mind, watching still. The rain didn't stop as I limped away from the blackwood plot, but it softened. A steady, whispering drizzle that hissed against the cemetery's sodden earth, each drop a tiny cold pinprick against my raw, mud-streaked skin. My boots dragged through the muck, the soles caked thick with black soil that squelched and oozed with every step, a wet, reluctant sound that echoed the exhaustion sinking into my bones. The flashlight hung limp from my wrist, its cracked casing rattling faintly, the beam long dead, leaving me to navigate St. Agnes by the faint silvery glow of a storm-shrouded moon breaking through the thinning clouds. My left knee throbbed, a dull, pulsing ache where it had slammed into Elizabeth Hayes's stone, each movement sending a sharp twinge up my thigh, the denim of my jeans soaked dark and clinging like a second skin, heavy with water and grit. The air was thick with the aftermath of the night. Pine needles torn loose by the wind littered the ground, their sharp, resinous scent mingling with the sour tang of wet rot, rising from the graves, a cloying mix that coated my tongue and stung my nostrils. My breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, fogging faintly in front of me, the cold lingering in my chest, despite the humid warmth that pressed down on Ashwood. The prickle on my neck was gone, faded to a ghost of itself. A faint itch I could almost ignore, but my hand still trembled, the memory of the locket's weight vivid in my palms. Silver shards glinting wet, the chain snapping under my desperate swings, the brittle hair crumbling to dust as Thomas's gray figure dissolved into the rain. That raspy ha-ha, dry as ash, sharp as a blade, still scraped at the edges of my mind, a sound I couldn't unhear even as the silence of the cemetery stretched around me, heavy and watchful. I reached the iron gates, their rusted bars slick under my grip as I leaned against them, the metal biting into my palms with a chill that seeped into my knuckles. The hinges groaned, a low, mournful creak as I pushed through, the sound swallowed by the drizzle's soft patter, tap, tap, tap against the leaves overhead. Beyond the cemetery, the mill road stretched dark and empty, its muddy ruts glistening faintly, snaking back toward town, through a tunnel of thrashing pines that swayed like mourners at a funeral, their branches clawing at the sky. My chest tightened, a flicker of dread, sharp and sudden, as I glanced back at the blackwood plot, half expecting that gray smudge to rise again, tall and faceless, its arms lifting toward me. Nothing moved, just the cracked remains of Thomas's stone, split and sunken, mud pooling in its jagged fissure like ink spilled across a page. The walk back was a blur, each step a labor, my boots sinking ankle-deep into the mire, the squelch and suck of the mud, a rhythm that matched the thudding in my skull. My jacket hung heavy, waterlogged and stiff, the zipper scraping my chin raw as it swung with my uneven gait. The wind carried faint whispers, the rustle of leaves, the drip of rain from branches, the distant hoot of an owl perched somewhere in the dark, but no creak, no ha-ha, no shadow on my heels. Yet my skin prickled, a lingering unease that crawled up my spine as if the cemetery's silence was a lie, a thin veil over something still awake, still waiting. By the time I reached Mom's house, the drizzle had tapered to a mist, a fine clinging haze that beaded on my eyelashes and blurred the edges of the world. The porch sagged under my weight, the warped boards groaning as I fumbled my keys from my pocket, fingers numb and clumsy, slick with mud that smeared the brass. The lock clicked, sharp, final, and I shoved the door open, the stale warmth of the house hitting me like a wall, thick with the faint must of old wood and the bitter tang of yesterday's tea, still sitting in its mug on the counter. I stumbled inside, kicking off my boots. They thudded wetly against the linoleum, leaving dark smears, and peeled off my jacket, the fabric slapping the floor in a sodden heap, water pooling beneath it in a slow, creeping stain. The kitchen was dark, the power still out from the storm, the fridge silent, its usual hum replaced by the drip of a leak somewhere in the ceiling, a steady plink against the sink's metal basin. I sank into a chair, the wood creaking under me, and rested my head in my hands, mud flaking from my fingers onto the table, gritty flecks catching the faint moonlight that slipped through the fogged window. My knee pulsed, a hot knot of pain, and my neck itched, faint, nagging, not a shadow of the prickle that had driven me to the grave. I closed my eyes, the locket's destruction replaying, metal buckling, glass shattering, that dry rasp, mine fading, and exhaled, slow and shaky, the tension bleeding out of me, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. Then a creak, soft, deliberate, from the hall. My eyes snapped open, breath catching, the chair scraping as I stood, slow, every muscle tensing. The flashlight was dead, useless, so I grabbed a knife from the block on the counter, its handle cold and smooth, the blade glinting faintly as I edged toward the sound. The hall stretched before me, a narrow tunnel of shadow, the walls papered in peeling floral print, their faded roses curling inward like clenched fists. Another creak, closer by the stairs, and I froze, the knife trembling in my grip, my pulse a frantic thud in my ears. "Thomas," I whispered, the name a dry croak, and the air shifted, cold, sudden, my breath fogging thick as it had in the cemetery, a chill that sank into my bones and turned my blood to ice. The mirror at the landing gleamed faintly, its glass fogged with condensation that hadn't been there before, droplets streaking down its surface like tears. I stepped closer, the floorboards groaning under my socks, wet, gritty, sticking to the wood. and raised the knife, the blade's reflection winking in the dim light. There, behind my own pale mud-smeared face, a gray smudge, tall and thin, its edges fraying like smoke caught in a draft, its blank face tilted, sharp, watching. My stomach dropped, a cold plummeting weight, and I spun. Nothing, just the empty hall, shadows pooling in the corners, the drip from the kitchen, a distant heartbeat. I turned back. The mirror was clear, fog gone, just my reflection staring back, wide-eyed, knife raised, chest heaving. The creak didn't come again. The cold lifted, but my hand shook as I lowered the blade. The handle slick with sweat now, not mud. I backed into the kitchen, eyes darting. Window, door, ceiling, every shadow a threat, every sound a lie. The locket was broken, shattered, buried. But Thomas's echo lingered, a whisper in the walls, a gray flicker I couldn't unsee. I sank back into the chair, knife clattering onto the table, and stared at the fogged window, the mist outside curling against the glass like fingers testing its strength. The rain tapped, tap, 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 soft, normal, but my neck itched, and I knew he wasn't gone, not all the way. The kitchen chair creaked under me as I sat there, the knife resting on the table where it had fallen, its blade glinting faintly in the sliver of moonlight that pierced the fogged window. The storm had faded to a whisper outside, a soft, persistent drizzle that tapped against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Each drop a delicate, rhythmic pulse that mocked the chaos still churning in my chest. My hands lay limp in my lap, streaked with drying mud that flaked onto my jeans, the gritty texture rough against my palms, a reminder of the cemetery's cold embrace. The air inside Mom's house hung heavy, stale, and warm, laced with the musty scent of old wood and the faint, bitter tang of tea gone cold in its mug. The porcelain chipped at the rim where it sat abandoned on the counter. My breath came slow now, shallow and uneven, a thin fog rising in the dimness, though the chill that had gripped me in the hall was gone, replaced by a dull ache that throbbed in my bones, my knee, my neck, everywhere Thomas Blackwood's shadow had touched. The power was still out, the fridge silent, its usual hum replaced by the drip, drip, drip of that leak in the ceiling, a steady plink against the sink's metal basin that echoed in the quiet, each splash a tiny ripple in the stillness. My socks clung to my feet, soaked and gritty, the linoleum beneath them streaked with muddy smears from my discarded boots, their laces tangled in a wet heap by the door. The jacket I'd shed lay there too, a sodden mass of denim, its zipper glinting dully, water pooling around it in a slow, dark stain that crept across the floor like spilled ink. I stared at it, unblinking, the weight of the night settling over me. Thomas's locket shattered in the mud, his gray figure fraying into the rain, that raspy ha-ha fading to nothing. But the mirror's flicker lingered, a gray smudge behind my reflection, its blank face tilted, watching. My neck itched, faint, nagging, a ghost of the prickle, and I rubbed it, fingers trembling, the skin raw and cold beneath the grime. The clock on the wall ticked, mechanical, battery-powered, unaffected by the storm, its hands creeping past midnight. The soft click, 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 a lifeline in the dark, grounding me as my mind replayed the cemetery. The ground splitting, the locket buckling under my swings, the dry breath on my face whispering mine. I'd broken it, shattered his anchor, sent him back, but the creak in the hall, the fogged mirror, the itch on my neck said otherwise. My chest tightened, a sharp pang of doubt, and I grabbed the knife again, its handle slick with sweat now, not mud. The blade a cold comfort as I stood. The chair scraping loud against the linoleum, a harsh, grating sound that jolted the silence. The hall stretched before me like a throat, narrow, shadowed, the peeling floral wallpaper curling inward, its faded roses stained with age, their petals drooping as if wilted by the weight of the house. My socks squished with each step, leaving faint, wet prints that glistened in the moonlight spilling from the kitchen, the air growing colder as I neared the stairs, a draft seeping from somewhere unseen, brushing my ankles with icy fingers. The mirror loomed at the landing, its frame warped. The glass is streaked clean now, no fog and no smudge. But I approached, slow, knife raised, my reflection sharpening with each step, pale, hollow-eyed, mud-streaked, the blade trembling in my grip. I stopped, breath held, watching. Nothing moved, no gray flicker, just my own face, staring back, wide-eyed and worn, the shadows behind me still and empty. I exhaled, a shaky gust that fogged the glass briefly, and lowered the knife, the tension bleeding out of my shoulders, my arm dropping heavy to my side. The creak didn't come again, no shuffle, no rasp, but the house felt alive, its silence a held breath, every groan of the settling wood a whisper I couldn't trust. I turned back, the stairs creaking under my weight as I retreated to the kitchen, the knife clattering back onto the table, my hands raking through my damp hair, tugging at the strands as I sank into the chair once more. The drizzle outside picked up, tap, 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 a steady rhythm against the window, the mist curling against the panes, its tendrils pressing close, testing the edges like something alive, something curious. Sleep wouldn't come. I knew it, felt it in the ache behind my eyes, the restless twitch in my legs. So I stood again, pacing the kitchen, the linoleum cold and slick beneath my socks, the muddy streaks smearing wider with each pass. The flashlight was dead, its cracked casing a useless weight on the counter, so I rummaged through a drawer, fingers brushing past dull scissors, a tangle of rubber bands, until I found a candle, wax-stained and half-melted, its wick blackened from some forgotten night. A matchbox followed, rattling with a handful of sticks, and I struck one, the hiss of sulfur sharp in the quiet, the flame flaring bright, then settling to a small, wavering glow that cast long shadows across the walls, flickering like restless ghosts. I lit the candle, wax dripping onto the table in slow, pale drops that hardened fast. The flame's warmth a faint kiss against my knuckles as I set it down. The light painted the room in soft amber, glinting off the knife's blade, catching the muddy smears on the floor, illuminating the fogged window where the mist pressed thicker now, a gray veil that blurred the world beyond. I watched it, unblinking, the candle's glow trembling with every draft that slipped through the house, the drip, drip, drip from the sink, a counterpoint to the rain's tap, 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 a duet that lulled my mind into a haze, exhaustion tugging at me, despite the unease coiled tight in my gut. Then a thud, low, muffled, from upstairs. My head snapped up, the candle flame flickering wild, shadows leaping across the walls as I froze, breath caught in my throat. The knife was in my hand before I thought. Instinct, fear, the handle cold again, my grip tight enough to ache. Another thud, heavier, deliberate, followed by a faint scrape like wood dragging over wood, slow and grating, a sound that clawed at my nerves. I stood, slow, the chair tipping back with a soft clatter, my socks silent on the linoleum as I edged toward the hall, candle in one hand, knife in the other. The flames glow, trembling with my pulse, casting my shadow long and jagged against the peeling wallpaper. The stairs loomed, steep, narrow, the banister warped and smooth under my palm as I climbed, each step groaning under my weight, a chorus of creaks that filled the silence, sharp and mournful. The air grew colder with every riser, a chill that seeped through my damp clothes, prickling my skin with goosebumps, my breath fogging thick now, swirling in the candlelight like smoke. The scrape came again, closer, from Mom's room at the end of the hall, the door ajar, a sliver of black beyond it. The sound dragging slow, deliberate, like a chair shifting inch by inch across the hardwood. My neck itched, sharper, insistent. And I stopped, the candle flame dipping low, wax dripping hot onto my wrist. A brief sting that snapped me from the daze. "Mom?" I called, voice thin, cracking, though I knew she wasn't home. Work, a late shift, she'd said days ago. No answer, just a scrape, 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 and a faint creak, softer, like a foot testing the floor. I pushed forward, the hall stretching endless, the floral wallpaper curling tighter, its roses now fists clenched in the flickering light, the shadows behind me twisting, stretching, as if the house itself leaned in to watch. The door to Mom's room creaked wider as I neared, slow, unbidden, revealing the bed, neatly made, the quilt's faded patchwork glinting in the candle's glow, and beyond it, her dresser, its mirror fogged thick, droplets streaking down its surface, like sweat on a fevered brow. I stepped inside, the hardwood icy beneath my socks, the air so cold, my teeth ached with it, my breath a plume that danced in the candlelight, curling upward toward the ceiling. The scrape stopped, silence falling heavy, oppressive, and I raised the candle, its flame trembling, the glow catching the mirror. There, a gray smudge, tall and thin, its edges fraying like smoke caught in a breeze, standing behind my reflection, its blank face tilted sharp, arms limp but rising slow, deliberate, as if reaching through the glass. My stomach plummeted, a cold hollow drop, and I spun. The room empty, bed still, dresser untouched. But the creak came. Creak, creak, soft behind me. And I turned back, the mirror clear now. Fog dissipating, just my face staring back, pale and wild, candle trembling, knife raised. The flame flickered, low, then out, wax spilling hot across my hand as darkness swallowed the room. The drip, drip from downstairs, the only sound, a faint heartbeat in the void. I backed out, knife slashing air, my socks slipping on the hardwood as I hit the hall, the stairs, the kitchen, breath ragged, chest burning, until I stood by the table again, the dead candle a lump of wax, the knife clattering beside it. The rain tapped, tap, tap, tap. The mist pressed close, and my neck itched, a faint, persistent scratch that wouldn't fade. I sank into the chair, hands shaking, and stared at the window, the gray, beyond it shifting, subtle, faint, a shadow that wasn't mine, a whisper that wasn't rain. Morning came slow, gray light seeping through the mist, the power humming back to life, the fridge buzzing awake. But I didn't move, the knife beside me, my eyes locked on the glass. Mom found me there, hours later, her keys jangling as she stepped in, her face creasing with worry. What happened? But I couldn't answer. The words stuck, the itch on my neck, a quiet hum. The locket was gone, shattered, buried. But Thomas lingered. A gray echo in the corners, a rasp in the silence. My blood his claim, my home his grave. I left that day, bag packed, no goodbye, just walked, the town fading behind me, The itch following, faint but sure, a shadow I'd never outrun.